Nebraska farmers have harvested 69% of this season's corn and 91% of this year's soybeans. According to the Nebraska Mesonet, soil temperatures at 4 inches Thursday morning range from 50 degrees in northwest Nebraska to 62 degrees in the southeast corner. Those temperatures could come down more slowly than usual. The National Weather Service Climate Prediction Center shows all of Nebraska has an above average chance for warmer than normal temperatures for the month of November. With milder weather, some growers might be thinking about fall nitrogen applications. Earlier this week, we talked with Nebraska Extension's Krienke and asked if there were pros and cons to applying at this time of the year.
I would say mostly cons. From a standpoint of utilizing that nitrogen, from an efficient standpoint of putting your dollars where they make sense for your crop the next year. A crop can only take up nitrogen when there's a crop in the field, right? Pretty obvious statement. Now, there's a lot of reasons why growers would put their nitrogen on in the fall, and I'm not dismissing that. And those are usually logistical issues. The soil's dry, so they're not going to compact the soil as much, as opposed to waiting in the spring during planting where they've got dual labor demands on them. So it's very hard to deal with during planting time, and so a lot of people opt for the fall. We would really like to suggest not doing that from an efficiency standpoint, because there's so much exposure risk for that nitrogen now from when you apply in the fall until when that plant can actually take up and use that nitrogen. Let's talk about the spectrum of efficiency, the best ways to deal with nitrogen management. You know, on the one side, it's applying in the fall, the soil's warm, there's no crop there. That's the most inefficient way because of all the risks that nitrogen can encounter. Now you go all the way to the other side and we use things like the UNL algorithm, which we've published in several NEB guides. That's a great way to assume a rate that you might need for a growing season. But what we're really focused on now in university research and extension is moving to better ways of side dressing your nitrogen, and not just with a predetermined rate, but actually using information like computer models coupled with sensors that can detect the stress of the crop and applying as needed, as opposed to let's try to predict what the whole growing season needs now and then more than likely get it wrong.
Let's talk about temperature. How does that impact it?
Temperature is everything with anhydrous ammonia, and that's typically what's being applied in the fall. And that is, they're injecting in the ground, and the soil needs to be at least below 50 degrees Fahrenheit to inhibit the processes that convert that ammonium, which is what anhydrous turns into a leachable form nitrate. And so that process takes time, and it takes a warmer temperature for the microbial populations to do. And so that's why we always say wait at least until the soil is below 50 degrees to inhibit that.
So if somebody's out there now injecting, putting it in, let's say, 50 to 55 degrees, what happens?
Well, obviously there's not a huge difference in terms of temperature there, but we would say don't do that. Wait until it gets below to be safe. There is still going to be this process that's converting it over. It's just going to be slower at 50 degrees than it would be at 55. You know, and even better when it gets below 40 and so on.
Are there additional concerns from moisture when you talk about fall applications?
No, most of those are myths about the soil being too dry. It takes almost microscopic amounts of moisture to actually adhere and grab the anhydrous once it's injected, so that's not a concern. The biggest concern would be getting it injected deep enough so that next year when you plant over these bands that they're not going to inhibit and injure your seedlings.
What about soil sampling during the fall? Is that something that's recommended?
Yeah, so soil sampling is a great thing to do now if you're going to be applying the nutrients this fall. For nitrogen, it's not as ideal as waiting closer to the time of actual application because nitrogen has so many more processes taking place. But I would say if we were going to step out of the nitrogen conversation into other just general fertility, this is a great time to sample shallow for phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, some of your micros like iron if you've had issues with those in the past. If you are going to sample for nitrogen, do some deep sampling to help aid in your decision making. So take a shallow surface sample of 0 to 8 or 0 to 12 if it's only going to be nitrogen, and then go at least 3 feet down after that to get a composite average of how much nitrogen is currently in your soil, so you can account for that when you make your recommendations and apply you're in.
We'll link to more resources about nitrogen applications on the Market Journal website.